For many of us, Malcolm summed up the spirit of the age, which was not only resistance to white supremacy and imperialism, but aggressive resistance to it. I think a lot of us had been raised watching Dr. King get beat up, and we had seen the students, the students in the Greensboro and people, dumping ketchup on people's heads and dragging people out. And so when Malcolm and the Nation of Islam rose up with the whole message of self-defense, along with self-determination, self-respect, it hit a chord in a lot of people. And I think I was just one of them, who took that to be my particular feeling and my line about it. Well, I didn't, I don't think it was, I myself thought of it as man per se, as opposed to woman. I thought of it as, you know, uh, the image of Black people, particularly. I guess there must have been something in that in terms of, maybe, you know, Black man standing up. But I took that as um, an image for all of us, like, because when I saw Fannie Lou Hamer, I identified with that too. Oh, the meeting in 1965 with Malcolm was set up by Mohammed Babu, who was the leader of the Zanzibari Revolution. And the three of us met in the Waldorf and talked. Babu was staying in the Waldorf. And so, Malcolm and I met there. And really, it was to have a discussion about, the state of, African American politics and African politics. Malcolm had been to Africa. He had come back not long from his tour of Africa, and then I think he went to France. I think went to Europe, and they wouldn't let him stay in France or something like that. But he had just come back, and we were comparing notes about the movement, state of the movement, and what was going to happen. Well, I thought Malcolm was a great leader. I mean, I mean that further confirmed that in my mind. He talked about the nature of trying of building a united front, what needed to be done, and that particularly with some of us, rather than denounce some of these mass organizations, that we should be joining them and trying to influence them, rather than just standing on the side denouncing them as backwards. And he really, I think, that was during the time he was trying to put together the old AAU, modeled on the Organization of African Unity, one the African American Unity after the split with the Nation of Islam. And that's really what we were talking about: how to expand, a Black United Front, how to create a stronger kind of Black organizational resistance and presence that would include not just one particular organization or one particular religion. As you remember, he was in the Nation, then he came out and became a Sunni. And all these moves of Malcolm's were aimed at trying to, come up with a secular Black United Front. It's interesting that that was King's last discussion I had with him a week before he was murdered. When he came to my house here in Newark, he talked about a united front. It's very interesting, of trying to pull together, the so-called militants and the so-called, nonviolent or, mainstream civil rights people. So it seems that both of those leaders were very conscious ultimately of the need to build a Black United Front in the real terms, not just an organization calling itself Black United Front, which is really usually what happens. You know, some people get together and then they decide a united front is everybody that they like or everybody who relates to them politically, when that's not a united front. Malcolm impressed, I mean, the people who saw Malcolm and who understood what he was talking about, I think he impressed me like that. He was a sincere, forceful man who uh, understood with a great deal of clarity what had to be done to, uh, resist white supremacy and to resist the whole kind of national oppression that black people were subjected to. And I think he was a man who had dedicated his life to that, and I could see that and feel that. And indeed, I think many of us at the time felt the same way, that this was what we wanted to do with our lives, fight against this kind of this kind of scourge, uh, which by that time was getting even more open, if you remember. You can't make it more than the influence of ideas. I mean, unless you're going to have him guiding my pen. It's a question of of the ideas and the image that Malcolm represented in terms of standing strong, standing tall in terms of what this oppression was. You see, the question of the oppression of black people uh, is so constant. It's not like it's something that we don't know about. It's so constant in our everyday life. And to see somebody who represents taking a stand, a forthright and sincere stand against that, and says the things that have to be said, no matter what the consequences are, and tells the truth about these things. That was very impressive to me and to a lot of people. And certainly, when you see these kinds of you know, vacillating, opportunist, super cautious Negroes that many times supposed to represent us, uh, who will not tell the truth longer than 20 seconds about anything. You know what I'm saying? Uh, and at that point, uh, Malcolm came, he came through because that was after the King thing and after King was assassinated. So Malcolm had come to the fore as the kind of major black leader, you see, which is why he was killed then, because that's when I mean, King wasn't killed then, but once they killed Kennedy, then a lot of black people began to see that the so-called nonviolent thing, you understand what I mean, was not the way. In other words, I think that Dr. King's influence had come to, let's say, I kind of was stalemated by the Kennedy assassination. The March on Washington, I think, was the kind of high water mark, and at the same time, the beginning of the end, I think, for that particular domination. And so the whole Malcolm's preeminence began to be clear. The fact that nonviolence would not work, the fact that black people had mainly been nonviolent and all they had gotten was violence in return, the whole question of self-defense, and also the question of imperialism being the enemy. Malcolm began to be clearer on that, when he came back from Mecca, and he used that as his means of saying that finally it was not the color of somebody's skin that was at fault. It was the nature of their politics, and the whole question of internationalism. That was very important, you know. And black people and people generally began to look at Malcolm now more closely because, the nonviolent thing had been I think, proven to be ineffective to some extent. And the fact that Kennedy, who black people look to as, quote, the only person who's going to make this nonviolent thing work in the first place, since they had killed him, it became clear that these people would kill anybody, I mean, since they had killed Kennedy, you know what I mean? It became clear, they would kill anybody. And then, of course, right away, then Malcolm. Malcolm's assassination for me was a declaration of war. I mean, I took it as a straight out attack. I mean, really a kind of open attack that could only be met with like some kind of equal attack. I mean, I don't think there was anything that made me as, I mean, seriously outraged, in the sense not only of being angry at the murderers, but of losing, you know what I mean, of having lost, some kind of great person and being outraged at the sense of the forces who could conspire to do that, that these people thought that they could actually make you submit to them, that they could make black people submit to them, and that they would kill anybody. I don't know, I was downtown at some book party at a bookstore, and it was a Sunday, and we had already formed an organization called the Black Arts, and I think hearing about that, that he had been murdered, it just made the people that I was with resolve to that we were going to go to Harlem. I felt outraged. I felt mad. I felt like I should be involved in trying to redress this. That it was like, just too much. That the whole thing had gotten beyond the case of just reacting indirectly one way or another, or in some other kind of way. That there had to be some direct um, answers. That Black people had to fight back directly, and consistently and continuously against this kind of, the madness of people that actually thought that they could continue to make you a slave, that they could continue for eternity to have you, submit to their madness. Um, and I mean, I feel that way even today. I mean, that's one thing I think that the whole kind of element of rage in terms of imperialism and racism has never left me. We organized the thing called the Black Arts up in Harlem. I think I was living downtown. I think by the next month we had, bought this building and opened the Black Arts, which was a group of Black people who were trying to put together an organization of Black artists. And so to us, that meant that had to be now, and it had to be done, and people needed to quit jiving about it, and they need to, like, you know if art really was going to serve the people, if it really could help make revolution, then those of us who thought that should get on with the work of it or shut up about it. That's the way I felt. Train, actually, the whole movement. I mean, the arts reflect the social movement all the time. I mean, the confusion in these Western academic circles. I mean, like these universities and these critics that are serving white supremacy and imperialism, notwithstanding, the arts are only a reflection of society. So when you have a social upsurge, you always have an artistic upsurge that reflects that, so that the whole anti-slavery movement, you get the slave narratives, and, the great speeches and orators and rhetoric from the Black Convention movement. When you have the whole Garvey, Du Bois, African Blood Brotherhood at the beginning of the 20th century, you got the Harlem Renaissance, negritude, negrismo, indigenismo, all that stuff. In the 60s with Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, SNCC, the Panthers, you have a Black arts movement that reflects that, because the artists who are most sensitive to what the society is doing, and particularly the people that who they draw their life sustenance from. The art has the same kind of desires. The art wants the same thing, so that somebody like Coltrane, who's breaking out of the standard stating of, quote, the American popular song as jazz and jazz solo, um, is a classic kind of case, because just like Malcolm moving through different levels of experience. I mean, Malcolm at one time was, robber, pimp, used to sell drugs. He was intimate with all the musicians because he used to be their drug supplier. Still, he was a man of culture. It's incredible. He was a person who exemplified the African American people in a way that those civil rights, in quotes, leaders chosen by white academics and white corporations could never be, which is why he was dangerous, you know. And so Train, I mean, he would come up, out of the South, and, church music, and then went to Philadelphia, played with all the rhythm and blues groups, Big Maybelle, and, finally coming up through bebop and Charlie Parker, and then finally had gone through that whole gamut of Black experience. And so when he came to the point where the society, Black people generally, were beginning to make a leap, a kind of revolutionary leap in their thinking, uh, I mean, his music paralleled that. I mean, we'd stand up and listen to Train play a 30-minute solo, you know what I mean? You wouldn't even know, it was the time had passed. because it was all of that feeling, all of that energy, all of that striving, and all of that uh, rage and all that beauty just reflected our own feelings at the time. And I think I always uh, hooked him up with Malcolm because of the fire that, I mean, when Chain would get down and start playing one of those, just mind crushing solos that would be screaming for 20 minutes, just screaming and screaming and screaming and screaming. You could hear, say, the rage of Black people talking about, America. I mean, you could hear not only Malcolm, but you could hear, somebody like a Rap Brown, or you might hear Stokely, or you'd hear, the Panthers. I mean, you could hear that the rap, in other words. I mean, and rap music, I guess, is a further extension of all that feeling. I mean, it seems like it's the best part of us, that the poetry and the music that's come into the 80s. When you get somebody like Public Enemy talking about it takes a nation of millions to hold us back, then you can see that that is a continuum, that it contains both the politics and the art in it, even though, people want to, diminish it, but they don't understand that they diminish it the same way they diminish us. They diminish it like they diminish our children. I mean, how could Public Enemy be serious since our children are like dope addicts and unserious? I think the whole African national liberation struggle had intensified after the Second World War. And by the 50s, um, you began to hear about people like Nkrumah, you know. And then I think the most dramatic, I know for us, the most dramatic thing was, of course, Lumumba. What was that, 1961? Something like that, when they killed Lumumba. At the time, the United States was in charge of the UN, and Lumumba was, of course, the first premier, independent nationalist premier of the Belgian, what had been the Belgian Congo, and of course, Rockefeller and the Belgians, U.S. government colluded to kill him. Mobutu, the Negro that's in there now, was directly responsible for it. And so, for a lot of young Black intellectuals, that marked a kind of um, coming to consciousness. I remember a lot of people went into the UN. I remember I was picketing in front of the UN, and I met people who were writers that I had known were writers. I had met them, for instance, Saskia Touré, I met him out there. A lot of people who were artists and, scholars of one kind or another, just young Black people. Uh, the Lumumba thing, sparked a kind of rise in consciousness. I think it deepens from that point on. I mean, Africa at that point, then the whole liberation struggles begin to be emphasized. People like Nkrumah, people like Cabral, people like Sekou Touré, they begin to come to the fore. And uh, of course the South African struggle. There were people there, and African revolution was gaining some kind of a place in young Black intellectuals' consciousness here in this country. And then, of course, Malcolm talking about Africa, and the Mau Mau rebellion. Even uh, in New York City, which people think is relatively sophisticated, there used to be a store, I remember, on Broadway. They used to have photographs in the windows that were trying to depict the Mau Mau rebellion the way they try to depict the Palestinians now as some kind of mad terrorists. And they had pictures of Kenyatta and pictures of the Mau Mau. They were supposed to be like taking white people's heads and, raping white nurses, all kinds of, trying to make the Mau Mau seem like they were the beasts and the monsters, not the Belgians who cut off people's hands, and not white supremacy and imperialism, which it is, and even to this day, with the invasion of Grenada and so forth. Well, we had been, more influenced by Africa and, of course, the Nation of Islam, and uh, that whole question of uh, African cultural revolution, and the whole question of just Black consciousness, was getting emphasized in the 60s. And after I got arrested in 1967 in the Newark Rebellion, and My head split open, my teeth knocked out, sent to jail and whatnot. I met the brother who had said the prayer over Malcolm. Haj Hisham Jabber. He came to my house at the time. I was living on the other side of town on Sterling Street. And he came there with some other people and said if I was a leader, I needed leading information. But anyway, I was right for that. He told me he wanted to give me this name, which was Amir Baraka, which was Arabic, because they're Sunni Muslims. And since Malcolm had become a Sunni, I was, could be influenced by that to that extent, And so I thought it was good. I changed it further, I modified it and made it, added the Bantu or Swahiliized instead of Amir Barakat, which is Arabic. Became Amiri Baraka, which is the Swahili pronunciation, because I was interested in the African emphasis. And that was it. And we were identifying with Africa. We were identifying with revolution. And even after, I got a title, Imamu, when I belonged to a cultural nationalist organization. But all the kids that Amin and I had, they were all had Swahili names. One got a Yoruba name. And so it would be kind of out of character for me to be the only Leroy walking around when I've got, Razes and Aminas and Amiris and, Shanis and Obalaji's part of the spirit of the time, the zeitgeist. I mean, it was something we wanted to do. Whatever we thought we had to do it, we were going to do it. Didn't make any difference to us. The question of the slave name actually was kind of we thought of it as an honor to take on African names, to get rid of, and actually, if you look at our history, you'll find it's not the first time, although black people right after the Civil War abandoned the slave master's name, but they would take on Anglo-sounding names, most of them. Some of them took on other names, but they would change their names anyway because they didn't want to be, named after their slave masters. So they would drop that name and take names. So black people changed their names. See, the thing about black history is why it's so important is the things that we think that we're doing for the first time, we found that had been done before. Like black people have burnt down every city. Black people have burnt down every major city in the United States at least twice, except the ones that just got settled. I mean, they burnt down New York City twice before the 19th century. They had burnt it down in the 18th century. In terms of they done burnt down New Orleans and Birmingham and Atlanta for the same reason. So in terms of our history, once you know it, you see that no, black people have been trying to get out of this for a long time and have been doing the same things. Well, that I never, all of that stuff, it might have had an effect, but when I was a kid, I always looked at that with a cold cast in my eye. I knew that was people making fun of us. I mean, no, that's why we were starved for them because that's why when somebody like Poitier came on the scene later, and Belafonte, we were so happy. Or even the brother that came before him, James Edwards, we thought it positive. Kids because we never saw any. That's one of the reasons we like Sabu and Turhan Bey because they were colored looking. I remember when Richard Conte, we used to identify with Richard Conte because he was at least dark looking Italian, you know what I mean? Uh, but Tarzan and things like that. We always knew that that was supposed to be some kind of. I always knew that that was supposed to be a put on of us, and even Mantan Moreland. It drugged me that people thought they could do that to us, as a kid. It made me uh, be kind of pissed off that people thought that they had the right to make us look like that. But at the same time, I thought Mantan Moreland was funny. Same thing with, you know, the rest of those people they were poking fun at. I thought they were funny. The problem was I knew that the people who had them on were trying to ridicule us. So I always had that kind of a dual. Mantan Moreland still has the most reasonable view about death that I've ever seen. Stay all the way away from it. In terms of the negative imagery, did it have an effect on? There's no doubt that it does have some effect in the sense that it begins to you see a parameter, a limit. You see what the society wants to make you. But usually, in terms of those of us who, the great majority of black people, I think that the great majority of us always knew that that was somebody else's limitation on us. I don't think we totally, the ones who actually thought that they were those characters, we see them in public office and whatnot. Those Negroes, the little, weak-hearted, scary acting Negroes. We can see them in our lives, and they're a minority. They've always been a minority. I mean, most black people saw that and always stood away from it, and knew that that was people who didn't like us trying to make fun of us. And certainly if I didn't know it from just my perception, uh, my parents and grandparents kept up a steady line of rap about it. There was no way you could get away from the dinner table and not know about, everything that was going on that white folks was trying to do to you, because they would be running it down. They were not just sitting there passive now. It reflected the way white folks saw us, number one. You see, the whole Amos and Andy and Beulah syndrome, it reflected their attempt at caricature. What they didn't understand is that there was a legitimate humanity and humor that they wanted to ridicule that couldn't stand ridicule. They wouldn't understand it. For instance, when they have Stephen Fetchit come by and ask, when one of these people is trying to get Stephen Fetchit to do work, and Stephen Fetchit makes a conversation, Stephen Fetchit wants to know, is Franco still dead yet? Now that's a heavy question. See, now you're going to ask this man, is Franco still dead? Or Franco, of course, the leader of the fascists. Now, if the man's going to get off into a long dialogue about Franco being dead, it might take 5 or 10 minutes to get through with that conversation. And Stephen Fetchit hadn't done no work yet. He's just standing there. So that's not lost on us. The thing about 68 is that it was, a feeling of war. It was conflict. Nixon and Agnew, who on the face of it were corrupt individuals who did not represent anything but violence and hatred of black people. And I think that from 67, certainly the intensity of black resistance, I mean, there was black people getting killed every week. I mean, Black Panthers getting killed, Republic of New Africa getting killed, all kinds of black people getting locked up, Ram, people having to leave, Robert Williams, Herman Ferguson, people in exile, and then people started getting murdered. I mean, they actually did a kind of bloodbath of the Black Liberation Movement. I mean, not only after the Malcolm X thing, but then all the people in between that, Bobby Hutton and Ralph Featherstone, Fred Hampton and Medgar Evers, and they were murdering people. And my own view is the people in the White House now, those far right Republicans had a hand in that. I don't see why we wouldn't believe that this country could go so sharply to the right with only one Democrat being elected since Johnson, and that was Carter around the Watergate tip, and not see that the whole wipeout of the Black Liberation Movement and the other liberation movements, because there was, Chicanos and Puerto Ricans, they tried to destroy the Young Lords in the Puerto Rican community, the Brown Berets in the Mexican community. And all these things were aimed at destroying the back of the resistance, the back of the anti-imperialist movement that now had joined with the anti-war movement for a kind of real furious kind of force. Well, I think that the whole question of Black Power had arisen even from King's marches and from the SNCC people, particularly Carmichael and the others, and the Black Power conventions that Adam Powell had set in motion in Washington. And the second one in 67 was in Newark, and in 68 in Philly. And then I think 69, they had one in Bermuda that the government of Bermuda banned most of the activists from even coming to. And so 1970, the Black Power Conference was transformed into the Congress of African People meeting. And at the Congress of African People meeting in Atlanta, a conference was called to be held in 1972. I was the person put in charge of putting it together, which would be a national convention to, choose black candidates to try to organize black political, power development. And the Gary Convention, which had, 3,000 delegates, about 8,000 people there, was an attempt to do that, to set up a congressional structure, if you will, a kind of, in terms of black history, if you know about the convention movement and things like that. 72 was the elections coming up. And what we felt is that if we could organize black political participation that we would have much more influence on American politics in 72. And so we had laid out a thing where we wanted to run candidates locally and, statewide and, um, even and have some kind of consistent national political influence on, candidates running for Congress and Senate and mayors and everything else to try to really get some kind of a consistent, Black political presence. And that's what Gary was about. And if you remember, we had Shirley Chisholm declared for president that year. Gary demonstrated that the not only that Black people felt that they needed some kind of organized national political representation, but that that was an important thing to do. What wasn't scienced out, or what we failed to be able to deal with, was the fact that the whole Black electoral movement, which was headed up mostly by those middle class Black politicians, that they would align themselves with the status quo institutions in many cases. Coleman Young walked out because Coleman Young at the time was representing the United Auto Workers. He might still be representing the United Auto Workers as mayor of Detroit, but he walked out because somebody had proposed a Black union where the unions wouldn't serve Black people, that there should be a Black union organized. And so Young had to hit the silk because he represented, the UAW. And so he pulled the whole Michigan delegation out. I was the Secretary General and I was presiding on the floor, and I didn't know what he was doing. So we had to call a recess and I had to go back there and find out what was on his mind. And it turned out that was it. He was just going through this kind of like quasi hysteria about it. But then people hit me to what was going on, and I talked to him, and he calmed down a little bit and told me, I can't go for this. I can't go for this. And he was assuming that I was pushing it. I mean, people always assume, since I was Secretary General, that I was pushing the various resolutions on the floor when it was just my job to raise them and get votes on them. Same thing with the question of Israel. Same thing with the question of busing. People assume they knew my position based on the way I was handling the floor vote. When I saw Coleman Young, I didn't even know him at the time. I just know it was the Michigan delegation, and they were one of the largest delegations in the convention, because one thing that was done very well is that we had proportional representation by Black people according to the number of Black people in a particular state. And we had, delegates, and those delegates were elected, and they represented Black people in those states. And all the states were represented. It was amazing to me. It was really impressive. One of the most impressive things that I've ever seen, that throughout the whole convention center. Of course, Richard Hatcher was the mayor of that town, so we had complete access to the town, to the police and to the institutions. And seeing that whole hall set up like that with the banners for each state, and Black people being represented and passionately arguing for these points, I think it filled us all with a sense of deep self-respect, knowing that ultimately the only thing keeping us down was the madman's gun, that it wasn't anything else, that we knew exactly what we wanted, and all we needed to develop was how to get there. I just want to know, it was my job to see that the things were running smoothly in terms of that floor, presiding on the floor. I think all three of us presided. Hatcher presided, Diggs presided, and I would preside. That was the kind of little triumvirate that we put together. One was electoral politician Diggs on the congressional level. Hatcher would represent local politics, and I represented the activists and the nationalists. And so we tried to keep that balance, which I thought was a good formula for dealing with our different constituencies. But I didn't know what the Michigan thing. There were so many different kinds of wild things going on. At one point, Roy Ennis led some kind of demonstration. Well, I didn't know what to make of it. Later, I attributed very negative things to it, knowing that it was just the UAW demonstrating against Black organizing. I think, like I always think, it's my job to do something about it. I mean, it's certainly not intimidating or anything. It's just a crazy, thing that's happening, and it's got to be dealt with. So I called a recess, and said, we got to deal with this. These people are walking off. I don't know how many delegates, 100 and some delegates getting up walking off the floor. Obviously, I guess like they would do in any big convention, you have to call it to a halt. I think we called it to a halt another time when I was up there. They called and said there was a bomb in there. and we had to call it to a halt again. Um, Although to tell you the truth, I wasn't gonna call it to a halt with the bomb scare until the police came out there, the black police chief, and said, "Hey, you better call it for a couple of minutes," because I didn't think it was a bomb. I thought it was just racists at work, which it proved to be. There was already that kind of internecine struggle between the forces of electoral politics, the little petty bourgeois status quo Negroes. Although I thought Charlie Diggs finally came a long way in trying to be more sympathetic to the mass line, and I think he paid for that, because he was supposed to be chairman of the House Committee on Africa, and then they bounced him out of there, just about that time, which is what they do, which is a pattern. I mean, I went to the delegations to try to find out if how people wanted to handle that. People obviously were angry at the way it was handled. uh, the electoral politicians had certain things that they refused to deal with. I mean, they no longer saw it as, quote, their constituencies, although that was their line, that it was their constituencies that they were reacting to. They were really reacting to their relationship with the United States government in some kind of way. Certain of the lines they would find embarrassing. The NAACP dissociated themselves from the convention the day before the convention opened. We hadn't said a word. Roy Wilkins came out with an editorial saying he didn't want to have nothing to do with us. You know what I mean? Um, but the electoral politicians who had to be drawn in it, because we drew them into it. We knew what we were doing. I mean, the activists, the nationalists, we drew the electoral politicians into it because they wanted a national strategy. And there was no other way to go except the way we were proposing. But once they got in there on the floor, some of the questions that came up were controversial. The thing on busing, the thing on Israel, for instance, the thing on the unions, the whole thing about a black political party. Jesse Jackson, for instance, got up and resolved that we should, declare a black political party. Percy Sutton got up and talked about a a black presidential campaign to nationalize the votes. We can see which way that went. Percy Sutton's won out. We thought that what we were doing was providing the transitional form for a third party, you see. When we thought about National Black Assembly, National Political Council, in my mind, I thought that what we were trying to set up was a kind of uh, focused headquarters, if you will. The idea of a third party did come up repeatedly. The idea of a third party, the idea of a black political party, and variations of that. They came up, but you see, as I said, the electoral politicians who were committed in the main to the Democratic Party, some to the Republican Party, they were opposed to that. You see, Jesse Jackson, as I said, came up with the idea. He supported the idea of a black political party. Uh, the black bourgeoisie, on the other hand, Percy Sutton came up with the idea of nationalizing the black vote by running a black candidate, which of course is an idea whose time has come for the last 8 years with Jesse Jackson. Now Jesse has taken that line, which was Percy Sutton's line. But I think it was the electoral politicians, the black caucus, um, that militated, and the various kind of electoral politicians who were connected to one of the parties or the other, mainly a Democrat, who always militated against an independent party because they always saw their particular interests hooked up with the Democrats or the Republicans. And it's still the same way, and I still think that's a debilitating factor in the Black liberation movement, that our so-called representatives are more hooked up to Democrats and Republicans than they are hooked up to the evolution and development of the Black liberation movement. That is very negative, and it must be opposed. Charlie Diggs was up there, and he was, chairing. And you see, there was the perception that whoever was chairing was running the meeting, although it was true to a certain extent. The Diggs and those electoral folks did not want certain things to come up, did not want them to get voted on. And their line of reasoning was that if you take this position, you're going to destroy this organization or this United Front attempt. You're going to destroy it as a mass vehicle because people will shy away from it. Well, obviously, they were talking about their relationship to the mass media and their relationship to the Democratic Party more than they were talking about their relationship to black people. Because I don't think the majority of black people would have shied away from the idea of a black political party. I saw that as my job. I was trying to see that the majority, who I always thought that I was going to speak for, because I wasn't an elected official. I wasn't a mayor or wasn't a congressman, but I was a black nationalist. I was an activist. And I thought a lot of those people had come to Gary because of our organizing, are, pleading with people to come and, be part of a whole black political development. And I thought it was important that the thing not fly apart, that we talk to the people and find out what could be done other than, just walking out. A lot of people felt uh, that they had really just been dismissed and deprived of their democracy by the way the elected officials through Diggs were, handling this particular question. I don't remember what the question was, whether it was the question of busing or the question of Israel or the question of Black Party, one of those things, because they were the ones that were really, uh, you know, um, controversial. But a lot of people felt that that wasn't right, that the thing should be struggled out. The elected officials were using their slick parliamentary manner and the fact that they were organized to try to keep things from getting uh, said and resolved that would embarrass them in terms of their relationships with the Democratic Party and the media and so forth and so on. Although they would always cite their constituency, who we were supposed to be in the first place, as the reason that they didn't. So I was in the main trying to um, discuss with people, what they thought, how they were going to approach it. I mean, after those meetings, people wouldn't go to sleep; they would caucus, and each state would caucus, and then there would be caucuses inside the caucuses because then you'd have the elected officials caucusing inside the state, and then you'd have the black nationalists caucusing inside there, and then a lot of times if there was Marxists or somebody else, they'd be caucusing. So I'd have to get to the heads of the various kinds of power focuses, in there and find out what each thought they were going to do and whether there was some kind of whether we were going to have some kind of accord, whether there was going to be a united front, or whether they were going to act crazy, or what they were going to do, whether you were going to put up a resolution, or you're going to walk out, or what you're going to do, and try to get some kind of accord. And really, I guess, like you would do if you were Speaker of the House and a regular thing. You go around and you try to get people to understand, what the greater good is, and to see that we have to be in this, and that uh, I didn't like what was done, and I'm talking to them, we discussing it, and we're going to try to find out how the democratic procedure is going to go on in here, because that can't go on, and trying to, at one hand, uh, relate to my own constituency, which in terms of black activists, the nationalists and so forth, the people who are not elected officials, the masses of people, and to, in other words, give them a sense that we were not going to be just misused, but at the same time, I thought that trying to hold the convention together and the National Black Assembly together, that I thought ultimately that was a good idea and it was an important idea, and we had to be willing to fight in there with these people and not just nut out and throw up our hands. So it was a kind of an endless talking to people in delegation after delegation, because I thought that that had to be done, particularly in delegations where you saw people had real problems, where there were delegations who were protesting, or delegations who were threatening to walk out, or delegations who had resolutions that couldn't be heard and things like that. So you had whole piles of papers that characterized different delegations. And then I would recognize from, standing on the floor surveying them, you could see problems in different delegations, what they were. And people were bringing me messages and sending you messages saying, New York wants to talk, Illinois is going to walk, South Carolina says so and so. And so then you'd have to look at these papers and you'd have to play fireman and go to these different delegations and find out what their story was. Why, and then there might be independent groups like Roy Ennis and CORE, who got some other kind of like half-baked scheme that they want to try to uh, mash on people, and then people want to get into all kinds of pushing and shoving, and on one hand, like those kind of um, real uninformed types. So it's the gamut of political reaction. And if you're going to manage it, if you're going to see it, if you're going to be the Secretary General, I took the job seriously, then you're going to have to deal with all those people and see that come time for that gavel to hit, everybody was sitting there and everybody was ready to go, and that they were there for business, no matter how drugged they might be at, brother so and so or mayor so and so, that they was ready to do business, and that they would be there, You know what I mean? And the thing was going to go on, and we was going to follow the agenda, and that's really what it's like. Unity without uniformity. And I had gotten, associated and influenced by Karinga, influenced and associated with Karinga back in, what was it, about 67, about that time. And that was one of the slogans that in his so-called doctrine, unity without uniformity, which actually is a united front, which meant that people had the right to maintain their own political views, even though they would submit in a united front formation to the greater need that they could agree on. You understand what I mean? That it didn't mean you had to completely abolish your views, but that there was an area in which you could submit to common kind of, common accord, common discussion and diplomacy, negotiation for the sake of everybody's. Well, I had been given a job to do. The assembly voted that I had to go down to Miami and see that the black agenda, which we put together, which was printed, we tried to get John Johnson Ebony to print it and distribute it, but we printed it, and it was the demands that the black delegates made of any candidates who wanted their vote, president, and so forth and so on. Well, Gary, I felt that that was one long and positive step that we had accomplished. I thought that Gary was something that we had done that had been very positive, and that now was the next step, because I always saw it in terms of increments and steps and degrees, and it was, like any journey, to get there, you had to take a series of steps, and I thought Gary represented a large step forward. And since I'd been given responsibilities that went past Gary, it simply meant I had to get ready for the next gig. Well, I mean, the tiredness is always, I think, the physical part of that is momentary. You feel really uh, now you begin to get your mind ready to analyze what has to be done now. What are the new tasks? What folks do you have to contact? What things do you have to do? And you begin to sum up and take a post-mortem at the same time, congratulating people and I guess yourself to a certain extent. But, I think there was a deep feeling for the people involved that we felt, I think, great respect for each other, because it was a large project, and it meant coordinating great many black people from all over the world. And to see that done and to see it done with such impact was a deeply satisfying feeling. We thought for sure that we were, on the winning track, without a doubt. Well, you mean black prisoners? There was a great spirit of camaraderie and solidarity in the 60s and early 70s, and people on the outside and people in the prisons, because so many people were getting arrested in the 60s. People were locked up with demonstrations, people were locked up in various organizations. Organizations were always going in, talking in the prisons to the extent that they could. I remember we organized a great deal in Trenton State and Rahway here. Not to mention we were locked up in some of them, most of them. I know we were in Rikers and Sing Sing. Um, then there's a women's prison over there in New York by the West Side waterfront that we were in speaking. I didn't even know it existed. But we've been in prisons to speak, and I know the activists always looked at prison as one way of reaching a kind of uh, potentially militant brothers and sisters who were already locked up, who had been, say, disillusioned by America, or had been disabused of their illusions about America, and many times were jailed either illegally or jailed simply, based on white supremacy. And we always thought of the jails as a kind of explosive uh, resource for revolutionary change. Certainly, people like Malcolm X had come out of prison, and the Nation of Islam had done a great job of transforming a lot of people who had been in prison, and some people in prison had been in the Panthers and things like that. So we saw revolutionary activity as a means of transforming prisoners into revolutionaries. And so the uh, the program of going into prisons, organizing and speaking. The prison, you get to change the movement. The people are the same, essentially. The movement itself changes. When the movement goes into decline, the relationship between, say, movement activists and prison activists declines. I mean, just like the black family gets weaker. I mean, it's all related to the question of social organization within the group. When the social organization of the group is more revolutionary, you see more progressive and positive, dimensions and definition to the group. Now you see more prisoners laid back, just doing their time. A big connection between the movement and the prisons because a lot of people in the movement were getting locked up. And so they were being carrying that message into the prisons. And a lot of people were locked up directly related to movement activities. And so when they put them in prisons, it became, a place where you could organize. I know when was locked up in Trenton, uh, the police did everything they could to put me in solitary. I dodged that. But when I was in Newark, uh, the pen over here in Newark, Essex County pen, they put me in solitary. They never wanted to have the activists in the population. You see what I mean? But it didn't matter. There was still strong ties between militant activity and people in prison because people in prison would resent the fact they were in prison in the first place, particularly if they were there around uh, revolutionary activities. So there was a stronger tie. And as the revolutionary motion began to stall out, the murders of Malcolm, the murders of Dr. King, the murders of wholesale murders and slaughters of Panthers and activists and lockups of people, then, like the movement itself, you begin to get a stalling and a reactionary kind of tone sets in. Well, you always saw that. It depends on the focus. I mean, Bumpy Johnson, when he went to Alcatraz for 12 years, I mean, he educated himself. He had, I guess, a triple postdoc in literature and world culture. I mean, based on people locked up, like Malcolm said he read the dictionary, was in prison. I mean, people make use of their time depending on their consciousness in prison. You find some very well-educated people in prison because they got the time to do that. But during the period of revolutionary insurgence, the kind of focus of that reading becomes different. People then are reading, Fanon and Malcolm X doctrines and so forth and so on, and Nkrumah, and the whole question of organizing in prisons and relating the prison movement to liberation movements. This becomes much more of the time. Nation of Islam was always well organized in prisons. Some of the other organizations, like I said, in New Jersey, we were well organized in prisons. Congress of African People, we had teachers in the major prisons who went there every week, teaching, about the Cultural Revolution and the Black Liberation Movement and things like that. So there was a closer tie based on the revolutionary, character of the times. By the way, they were organized. They had many different organizations. The inmates were organized in different organizations. Like I said, they have the Nation of Islam, the Congress of African People, the Black Panther Party. They had them in the prisons. They had a prison Black Panthers, a prison Nation of Islam, a prison Congress of African People. The same things you saw on the outside. Now, in the inside, there still are Black consciousness movements, but not nearly as many as there were. The nation is probably still there, not as much as it was, but you see more people now who, when you say it's the same as the outside, mean that people are smoking as much dope or shooting as much dope inside as they are outside. That's true. But you still have a core of people who develop their consciousness when they're in prison because they're in school. They see it as a school, not just a prison. Malcolm X, saw him as the maximum leader of the movement. I saw him as the spearhead, as the kind of you know, um, really, I think that sums it up as the kind of leader, both inspirationally and in terms of politically, that he was the spearhead of the movement and the cutting edge of it. Well, for me, Dr. King, when I was a young man, I never really approved of Dr. King, what Dr. King did. I always saw that as something imposed upon us by people thinking that we had to qualify to be free. I never agreed with that. I just recently came to see Dr. King in a more progressive light because Dr. King was much more progressive than even the image that was given out by his sycophants and followers, you see. But make no mistake, Martin Luther King was a positive force in our movement. The fact that a whole lot of these preachers think they can do the same thing, just stand in the pulpit, is not true. Dr. King was an activist, and he was a very progressive man. I mean, Malcolm represented a different class of people that I identified with. He represented the masses of people. Masses of black people never were willing to sit still and let anybody spit on them, and you know, them to be brutalized so that they could appear to be, civilized to white people, the most uncivilized people on the planet. Uh, so that a lot of us when we were young rejected that, that idea that somehow, because black people had never been violent in that sense. So, our protests in the main were nonviolent. When black people got violent, then you would know about it. So that never appealed to me. What appealed to me about Dr. King later was the way I began to understand his thinking as it developed around the question of Vietnam, the question about uh, activism. Um, and finally, when he began to talk about a united front and to deal with the whole issues of the workers, which finally got him killed, the whole Memphis garbage strike, then it became much more dangerous to the establishment. But I think then I began to see King in a little different way. Malcolm, to me, represented the masses of people straight on. He was trying to talk about self-determination and self-defense and self-respect. He wasn't trying to uh, appease, any part of the establishment. That's essentially what the establishment, the white supremacist establishment, was corrupt, and the Negroes attached to it were corrupt. That's what I felt. That's what I feel now. And I thought that when King first appeared, too much of what he said appeared to be couched in the rhetoric of the black establishment as it kowtowed to the white establishment, and later on, as I said, I began to see King in a different light based on his activism and based on the fact of the development of his thought. That he never represented that. He represented to me straight out resistance to racism and imperialism.